There is sort of a running joke in philosophy circles, and it is funny precisely because it's true. And it's that the people who read philosophy tend to seem relatively well adjusted, curious, and pleasant to be around, while the people who produce it were, by an overwhelming margin, genuinely troubled human beings. And not troubled in the romantic, tortured artist sense that makes for a flattering biography, but instead in the sense of this person literally had multiple mental breakdowns throughout their life and had an array of mental health and substance abuse problems. And if you spend enough time with that pattern, then you start to wonder whether it's a coincidence or if there really is something specific to philosophy that extracts a particular psychological toll from the people who pursue it seriously. Or is it that philosophy doesn't necessarily produce these people so much as it attracts them? The questions that animate serious philosophical work are precisely the questions that only arise naturally in minds that were already not entirely at peace. So, today we're going to examine what this means for philosophy and whether or not that means that those who study it are the true hypocrites. Well, before you can evaluate whether philosophy produces psychological damage, you need to appreciate what it actually demands of its practitioners. Because most people encounter philosophy at a distance that makes it look like an intellectual hobby and a pleasant exercise in thinking carefully about interesting questions. But that is not what it looks like from the inside for the people who actually do take it seriously. Rene Descartes inaugurated modern philosophy in the 17th century by deciding to do something genuinely destabilizing. He resolved to doubt everything that could possibly be doubted, and to strip away every assumption and inherited belief until he reached something he could know with absolute certainty. The meditations begin with him sitting alone by the fire, systematically dismantling his confidence in his senses, in his memory, in the external world, and even in the existence of others' minds, entertaining the possibility that everything he has ever experienced was produced by a malicious demon intent on deceiving him. He works his way back to certainty through the cognito. I think, therefore I am. But what matters for our purposes is the method. Descartes used radical doubt as a tool, deployed it deliberately, and put it away when the project was complete. The problem is that a certain kind of mind, once it has learned to doubt that thoroughly, cannot simply put the tool away. The doubt becomes a mode of perception rather than just an instrument. The fact that the entire architecture of Western meaning making, meaning Christian morality, Enlightenment rationalism, and the concept of objective truth, was a human construction, not a discovered reality. His famous quote, "God is dead," was not a celebration of his death, but it was simply a diagnosis. And Nietzsche understood the implications more clearly than almost anyone who has quoted it since. If the structure that gave Western civilization its values, its purpose, and its sense of cosmic order was gone, then the question of what to put in its place was not merely academic. It was truly an emergency, one that most people were not yet aware that they were living inside. He spent the decade of the late 1800s trying to answer that specific question. His final completed work opens with chapters titled "Why I Am So Wise," "Why I Am So Clever," and "Why I Write Such Good Books." Not as irony, but in apparent earnest. In January of 89, he collapsed in the street of Turin. He spent the last 11 years of his life in a state of mental collapse, cared for first by his mother and then his sister. Now, whether that collapse was the end point of a philosophical journey taken too far, or the eruption of a neurological condition that would have found him regardless, we can't say with 100% certainty. But what we can say is that Nietzsche had spent the better part of 20 years doing exactly what philosophy at its most rigorous demands, looking directly at the most destabilizing truths available without flinching. Ludwig Wittgenstein is a different kind of case study, less a story of complete collapse than of someone who lived his entire life at a pitch of intensity that most people cannot sustain. He repeatedly abandoned his academic career to go live alone in a remote cabin in Norway, or to serve as a schoolteacher in rural Austrian village, or to work at a hospital porter during the Second World War, because the ordinary rhythms of academic and social life were simply unbearable for him. His early philosophy concludes with one of the most quietly devastating lines in the history of ideas. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. It is either a statement of philosophical discipline or the most precise possible description of a man who has thought his way to the edge of what language can do and found that what matters most exists in the silence on the other side. His later work spent decades systematically dismantling what his earlier work had built, which is an unusual thing for a philosopher to do, and suggests someone for whom the philosophical project was never a comfortable academic exercise, but instead a continuous, restless, genuinely urgent search for something he was not sure he could find. What makes Wittgenstein fascinating in the context of this question is that his torment was so visibly philosophical in character. He wasn't troubled despite his thinking, because he was troubled through it, in it, and by means of it. The intensity that made him one of the most original minds of the 20th century, and the intensity that made him almost impossible to be around, were not separate qualities. But the counter-argument is equally worth taking seriously, because not every troubled philosopher arrived at their trouble through philosophy. Some actually arrived at philosophy through their trouble, and the discipline gave them a language for territory that they were already living in. Kierkegaard is the clearest example of this. His philosophy of anxiety, despair, and the stages of existence reads as so transparently autobiographical that it is almost uncomfortable, as though he constructed an entire philosophical system primarily to make sense of his own interior life. And the system happened to be brilliant. His concept of angst, or anxiety not about any specific thing, but about the sheer open-endedness of existence, did not emerge from pure deduction. It emerged from the fact that he lived in a state, recognized it with unusual clarity, and had the intellectual tools to map it out. And Schopenhauer presents a similar structure, though with considerably less sympathy available. His fundamental conviction that existence is driven by a blind, insatiable, fundamentally suffering will, and that the wisest response to being alive is the gradual denial of that will, is an elaborate intellectual architecture built to justify a temperament that was pessimistic and resentful long before it was philosophical. He was, by all available accounts, deeply unpleasant. He was consumed by his rivalry with Hegel, paranoid about his reputation, and constitutionally incapable of the ordinary pleasures of social life. Now, whether the philosophy produced the disposition or the disposition produced the philosophy is genuinely difficult to determine. And perhaps the honest answer is that the question assumes a cleaner separation between a thinker and their thought than actually exists. The pattern across all of these figures points towards something worth stating directly: that philosophy is one of the only intellectual traditions that offers no implicit guarantee that thinking clearly will lead somewhere comfortable. Following the argument wherever it goes is the methodology, and wherever it goes is not always somewhere you would have chosen to end up. Thinking carefully about morality might not produce peace. Instead, it might simply confirm that you are going to die and that most of what you do will not persist. The philosophers who produced the ideas that we still read centuries later were, in many cases, people who could not avail themselves of that protection, either because their minds would not let them stop or because they had already been stripped of the ordinary comforts that make it easy not to ask. And what they found at the end of those very long roads was sometimes clarifying and sometimes very devastating, and frequently both at the same time. But the examined life, followed honestly to its conclusion, has its own costs. And the people who paid those costs most fully are exactly the ones whose names we still know. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see y'all next time.